Good morning, everybody, and I hope you are having a great event and you're awake and have some tea or coffee handy. And I'm going to be talking for a few minutes about 100 terabytes and PARADISEC, the nightmares and the dreams of archiving and archives, and some of the challenges we all face in this 21st century. I'm participating in this event from the city of Annapolis, Maryland, in the United States. And I acknowledge the indigenous peoples who lived in this place before the arrival of the English, the Piscataway and the Nantego, among many others that passed through here and lived here and contributed to making it what it is. I also acknowledge the enforced labor of the many enslaved peoples who worked here and also made this place part of what it is. And it is with those acknowledgements, then I'll get started with the nightmares and dreams of archiving. Let's see there we go, yes. Here's the nightmare, or one of them. They lie for decades in forgotten and damp and moldy vaults, and then sometimes they return. You've seen movies about this, but maybe not with the same result. And they can transform the living into their own kind, especially the youth. Like zombies, after decades in the vaults, they don't look as good as when they were placed there. Because these zombies aren't people, they're recordings, and they don't eat brains, they actually feed brains. That is, if they survive to come back at all. Archives are sometimes purposely destroyed and terrorized by terrorized local inhabitants. The Serbs bombed and shelled this archive and library. The United States bombed by accident and destroyed an archive in Iraq. And many archives have suffered grievous damage. And we know that for all of the best intentions of preserving for the future is a very unpredictable thing. In fact, the present is becoming really unpredictable. Marx called them nightmares. Marx said the tradition of all dead generation weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living. And just when people seem engaged in revolutionizing themselves and things and in creating something that has never existed precisely in such periods of revolutionary crisis, they anxiously conjure up the spirits of the past to their service and borrow from them names, battle cries, and costumes in order to present a new scene of world history at this time-honored disguise and borrowed language. Marx was condemning what happened in the revolution of 1848. But I think also many people would agree that he is wrong about the past and its role. There are many different visions of the past, and the past may be very much in the present and not a nightmare on the brain, but actually a stimulant to it. But there are nightmares for archives too, and I was going to write a song about this for you all, but it got so tedious that I think I'll just sing the last line of it, the last verse of it, because it's about the 12 nightmares of archiving. And it goes a bit like this. These tapes, they are all sticky, need to upgrade software. Hackers trashed my servers, research parameters changing, air conditioner failing, website needs redesigning. We didn't get the grant, we need much more money. Equipment can't be found, the staff members leaving grant applications due. You need courage, vision, and good partners too. Which of course, the last line is the title for my talk today. Happy 100th terabyte, PARADISEC. A reanimator of zombies, turning nightmares into dreamed of resources and showing others how to do it through courage, vision, and many, many thoughtful and active partners. From the rest of this paper, I'm going to talk a bit about, start on archives and some of the challenges that archives face, and finally, how we are trying to deal with them and how they might be dealt with. And certainly PARADISEC is already showing the way, as I suggested here. Shubhra Chowdhury and I wrote a paper on archives, because archive seems like a singular thing. It's a thing, an archive. It's a place, it's a building. And we think it's much more fruitful to think about archives as something that has a number of distinct functions. Each of these can be undertaken in different ways, and they don't all have to be in one place. They don't all have to be in one administrator's hands. They can be dealt with differently and by different people. And yet, if you think of the function of the archives, then the criticisms and thinking about how archives can improve themselves become a little more tangible and a little less abstract. And the 6 functions that I sort of have now are the relationship of the archives mission statement to a larger organization of which archive is a part. Now, some archives are parts of academies of sciences. Those are research archives usually. Others are parts of large organizations. That the Chicago Symphony Orchestra has an archive, and everything that goes into it is related to the symphony orchestra's activities. Some archives are community archives, and they so the community missions and interests are then reflected in the mission of the archive. But there is always, or almost always, some context within which missions are decided on. And then there are acquisitions. What is acquired and who provides it? As an organization, once you have it, how do you organize it so that you can find it again? That's not an easy thing as archives get bigger and bigger. It's one thing for some of us on our bookshelves, but it's much harder than an archive. Preservation. How do you keep what you've acquired and organized from deteriorating? And how do you, so that it can be used sometime in the future? And then the access function. Who can access the archive and how? In some, that's very simple. The Chicago Symphony Orchestra, it's people who work with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra can, and then parts of it are available to the public. Others may have very different ways of providing access. It may be the members of the community that made it, for whom it is made. It may be researchers from all around the world. It could be for nobody at all. And then there's dissemination. How do you reach audiences? How do you, what do you do to bring what is in the archives to the people who would most benefit from it, and even to the people who wouldn't benefit a lot from it, but might benefit in some ways? Archives all have different schemes for this. The Berlin Phonogram Archives, founded in 1900, began as a research archive, and then has done a lot of dissemination on very well-documented boxes of CDs from its early collections. The Indiana University Archives of Traditional Music that I was director of for 6 years at the time has almost 3,000 field collections, and it also gives access to some. And the purpose of the collection is for researchers, but as time goes on, we've discovered that researchers don't use the archives nearly as much as the communities that were recorded in them. And for those people, the recordings can be profoundly influential and useful. PARADISEC, of course, you know all about, and you'll be hearing more about in this conference. I think it's worth just admitting that I fully agree with Linda and her colleagues who wrote that every repatriation, every return is different, and it's not an easy process necessarily. And my own efforts at returning the recordings I made and deposited in the Indiana University Archives of Traditional Music, that rather tall building, at the request of the Suya Kinseji, from whom I had learned so much and whom I'd recorded, I had a digital copy made and sent it back to them on CDRs with detailed documentation in Portuguese that some of them now read, so that they could find what it was they were looking for. It never occurred to me the first thing they would do would be to rip all the CDRs into MP3 files, and every piece of documentation that I had so carefully prepared was totally unrelated to the number of the MP3 file. The other thing I found was that the person who was in charge of the Culture Center and the community archives, of course, was related to everybody else in the whole community. And so all of his affines felt very awkward asking him for copies of anything, because affines don't speak to each other. And if you aren't going to speak to someone, it's almost as easy to write to me and ask me to send the copies it is to go 100 yards or so to where the data was kept and where the computer was kept that had it on it. And while some people found the recordings really interesting and useful, and one of the chiefs, one of my main teachers' sons came up and said, "Our father apparently forgot a story and he never told it to us, but he told it to you. And it helped us understand a whole lot of other things that we never had understood." And that's one of the things, we never know what our collections will be useful for. But something worse, something not very happy happened. And that was that when the elders heard one of the ceremonies that I had recorded, they realized that they had made a mistake when they sang one of the songs. And they were mortified. And they looked back at the past 20 years or so, the 25 years since I've recorded it, and they thought of all the terrible things that had happened and blamed themselves because of what had happened in that song. So returning recordings is indeed a different process in different places. In some cases, it's teaching and inspiring. In other places, it can be mortifying and difficult to deal with. And we don't know who are returning it, and the archives certainly wouldn't know. I'm going to turn to archives now briefly, to the functions of archives. Most archives in the world face the same challenges. And there are three critical challenges that I want to talk about now, and because it's not just about Australia and it's not just about the Pacific. It's really everywhere in the world. These challenges are nagging us and giving us nightmares and driving us to come up with solutions. Get up to there. And this isn't a challenge. This is just a fact that archives are under suspicion in the 21st century. Old ways of doing things are quite rightfully being criticized, and new ways of doing things are emerging, but haven't been necessarily completed and completely thought through. And Miguel Garcia wrote a very nice short essay called "Sound Archives Under Suspicion," published in Historical Sources of Ethnomusicology, Contemporary Debate, edited by Suzanne Seeger, Ingrid Atkinson, Gerda Leichner, and Susanna Sardo. And it's a very thoughtful piece. And he says, if, as I have stated, archives are not things, but knowledge, discursive knowledge, then we could accept that many people, collectors, researchers, archivists, technicians, museologists, intervene in that knowledge. And if we have many interventions, we have several ideological and aesthetic conditionings taking place. And archives are fundamentally not holding things, but holding a place for conversations. I think Peter Toner wrote something very similar about archives as knowledge and places of encounters. And Garcia said the reason to put archives under suspicion is to encourage them to change and to encourage new ways of recognizing the complexity of the materials and the ideas and the ideologies interacting that are taking place in archives and with archival materials. One of the first major challenge I would argue facing archives is the tragedy of Humpty Dumpty, as I've called it in a paper I just finished. And you may know about Humpty Dumpty, who sat on a wall and then fell off it. And all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put the shell and egg yolk and albumin all sliding around and put it all back together again. And our recordings of a performance, whether they be audio recordings or photographs or notes in a journal, all of the recordings are partial. They're fragments. We only can capture a fragment of what was going on. Some things we can't record at all. We don't see them. We don't hear them. We have no way of recording odors and smells and touch and excitement in a way that we can record tones and rhythms. So that what we have in the result of descriptions of events are pieces, unrelated to one another in some ways, and often fragmented and put in different places, so that an ethnomusicologist's field notes may go to one place and the recordings may go to another and the photographs may go to yet a third. And it's very difficult to bring them back together again. A recording of an event is not like DNA. We can't, alas, create, or maybe just as well, create a whole performance out of an hour's worth of tape. And that has implications for what archives need to be doing in terms of finding the rest of the materials, in addition, if they're audiovisual archives, finding the other formats, and also finding different performances of the same things or other things from the same group, which may be scattered again all over the world or in different places, and trying to bring them together so that when they can be shared with or returned to or asked for by communities, there's actually enough there for them to be able to supplement and find something that they consider useful for themselves and their futures in the materials that are returned. It's difficult to reunite those, and we have a long way to go because most of our cataloging is by institution rather than the larger. Well, there's Humpty Dumpty on the ground, and to a certain extent, I've argued that it's the documentation of an event that actually fragments, and we pushed Humpty Dumpty off the wall. Second major problem facing archives is the loss of analog recordings. And this is something everyone in this watching this is probably already aware of, but it needs some hard thinking, because all analog and digital tapes face total loss due to obsolescence. And that obsolescence date is coming closer and closer. Most equipment is obsolete. No one's making it anymore. And so pieces are hard to find. Machines are hard to find to play it in. We may eventually have tapes that would play if we had any machines to play them on. And the rapid changes of formats in digital formats, especially, is making copying onto a different format, into a file format, a digital file format, extremely difficult. And it will only get more difficult. Most archives are preparing for this. Most private collections are unprepared. And especially endangered, in my experience, are community-made recordings. Almost every community in the world has members of it who themselves are scholars. They think about and they value the history and the music and the life of their own community, and they have spent a lot of time recording it. Unfortunately, those recordings also will disappear and be unplayable if steps are not taken to get them either into an archive or get them somehow transferred. And Aaron Fox in New York City at Columbia University has first had a project to return archived materials to peoples in Alaska, but now he's on another moment of his project, which is actually to get the materials recorded in Alaska by the communities themselves into a repository where they will be safe. Whose recordings will be lost and whose will be saved? These are issues that have to do with ethics and politics and things that we all care deeply about. It's not just, it's going to end, we can't do anything. The question is, what are we going to do to make sure that there's some thought and equity in what makes the transition into the future and what is simply left behind and not saved. Third major problem is security of digital data. The internet isn't a safe place, as we all know, nor are most servers. Private companies are not stable environments. Private companies change their priorities. They make for-profit decisions, and the proprietary software often locks data into obsolescence. This isn't just a new thing. Record companies in the past are famous for having thrown out master tapes or allowing fires to consume massive amounts of stored recordings because it just didn't seem to be worth the money to preserve them. And we see similar things happening on Facebook or various sorts of social media where a decision will suddenly be made by the company and all of the chat comments may be lost or you may be kicked off it and have your materials disappeared. So I don't think it's safe to consider that for-profit industries will necessarily be the way that we're going to be able to ensure preservation of digital data. I think we need to be on the alert for ways that that's my phone saying I have talked for 22 minutes and I'm going to keep going for a few more and then it's all yours. How do we manage this too? How do we manage the security of our systems? While making an independent website is usually the best way to control it, though there are a lot of broken links around, some of the most engaging debates and some of the most creative use of material is actually happening on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and elsewhere. And we need to be thinking about where the efforts of community work and community preservation of ideas is going to be placed. Now, this may be solved in the future by interesting new technologies of massive storage in tiny spaces that allow almost everything to be saved. But the question is, who is going to control that, and how people will have the right not to have their recordings spread around the world, and have the right to their own decisions about how they want themselves. The Kinseji that I work with don't want their material on the internet. They ask me I only post what they have actually authorized me to put up, because they said, no, that's ours, and somebody wants it, they need to ask us for it, and preferably we want to know how they're going to use it. That kind of decision is not really in the vision of most of the people pushing for free access to all knowledge on the internet. There's some interesting publications on archives in the 21st century. I recommend one by Anne Gilliland, she's sort of a philosopher and teacher of archiving, conceptualizing 21st century archives. And she talks about what she calls an archival multiverse. And the archival multiverse, she says, refers to the plurality of evidentiary texts, memory-keeping practices and institutions, bureaucratic and personal motivations, community perspectives and needs, and cultural and legal constructs with which archival professionals and academics must be prepared to engage. It's also, with many archives and many data locations, it becomes a really plural and interesting environment in which to work, and I think it's going to change our understanding of history, and will change our understanding of the present. And the ability to have all of those present will really change, I think, how much is available in the future to people when they wish to look back at their past or bring things from an earlier recorded period into the present. I think that the problem of Humpty Dumpty may be solved partially by the multiverse and also by the motivated people in the communities that put him back together. Another book I was reading for this was Popple, Prescott, and Mutibwa, Communities, Archives, and New Collaborative Practices, published by Bristol. And they highlight in several places that the balance of power shifted in terms of the future of the archive per se, offering important challenges to data longevity, preservation formats, and standards, and accepting a new kind of fluid archive. I'm not sure that a collection that does not have a preservation objective, that doesn't foresee trying to keep something for a future use, can actually be called an archive. It may be a project, it may be a wonderful thing to put together, but if there's a doubt, if there's no effort to make sure that 50 years later, somebody's grandchild or great-grandchild or student can access the recordings, then I don't really think we can call them archives. I think there has to be, again, more collaboration between really interesting and important, very significant initiatives of assembling data, photographs of horrible events and family reunions, good events, and even so all those assemblies and all of those perspectives on life, it seems to me need to somehow be allowed to have parts of them brought to the future, the parts that people would like to put into an archive. So we have challenges. All archives have them. They're around the world, and I have just the last thing to say on this, and that the challenges ahead are tremendous and exciting and under suspicion, but also with great possibilities. And just a look at the website of PARADISEC shows anybody that you're already thinking about these things, and PARADISEC is not only thinking, but showing, as I said, how to go about addressing some of these. And I wish PARADISEC many more terabytes, many more hundreds of terabytes, and as soon as possible, because we don't have much time. The communities that we care about don't have much time. Scholars don't have much time, and there's so much to do. And I hope that you're going to do it, all of you together. That's it. Thanks.